In 1176, an emperor's army of elite knights charged with unstoppable force, but they were crushed by simple townsmen and militia fighting for their freedom. The year was 1176, and the plains of Lombardy trembled beneath the iron heel of empire. Frederick Barbarossa, Holy Roman Emperor, had descended into Italy with the might of his German knights, determined to crush the rebellious communes that dared defy his rule. To him, the cities of the Lombard League were nothing more than insolent subjects who had forgotten their place. But the cities remembered. They remembered the fires, the sackings, the weight of imperial taxes. Milan, raised years before, now rose again from its ashes, its citizens sworn to fight to the death rather than bow once more. Townsmen from Verona, Brescia, Piacenza, and beyond sent forth their militias, bakers, blacksmiths, merchants, ordinary men hardened not by knightly tournaments but by survival, by loyalty to their homes. On a warm May morning, the two forces moved toward one another near the village of Legnano. The imperial knights, armored in steel and mounted on massive destriers, seemed unstoppable, living fortresses on horseback. The Lombard army, by contrast, was a patchwork host. Foot soldiers in leather and chain, spearmen gripping crude weapons, militia cavalry drawn from guilds and towns. Yet at their heart stood something greater, the Carroccio, a great war wagon, draped in scarlet and bearing the banner of Milan. It was both altar and standard. Priests rode with it, chanting prayers, while trumpeters called men to courage. Around it, the best infantry of the League swore to fight until death. For as long as the Carroccio stood, the communes would never yield. Among these men was Alberto, a young smith's apprentice from Milan. His hands bore the scars of hammer and fire, not swordplay, yet he gripped his spear as though it were an extension of his own soul. Beside him stood Matteo, a grizzled veteran of street skirmishes, who spat into the dirt and muttered, "Steel shatters, lad, but a man's will, that's what wins a war." From the distance came the glint of the imperial host. Thousands of armored riders, banners of the eagle soaring, the ground trembling beneath their hooves. The shadow of Barbarossa had fallen across Lombardy, and in that shadow the free men of Italy prepared to stand. The Lombard League gathered in solemn silence around the Carroccio. The massive wagon, adorned with scarlet cloth and the great cross of Milan, stood like a shrine at the heart of their camp. Priests raised relics high, incense curling into the morning sky, and voices rose in fervent hymns that mingled with the clatter of arms. Each commune sent its sworn men to the wagon, to lay hands upon its wood and swear the ancient oath, to defend the Carroccio or perish beside it. For as long as the banner stood, the spirit of the cities would endure. Alberto stepped forward with trembling hands. He placed his palm against the warm oak, still stained with oil and wax from the candles burning before it. The priest's voice rang out, "Do you swear to defend your commune, your brethren, your freedom, with your life?" "I swear," Alberto whispered, though his voice cracked with fear. Beside him, Matteo spat once more and pressed his scarred hand firmly to the wood. "I've lived long enough to see emperors come and go, but no emperor will take Milan again, not while I draw breath." A roar of voices rose as hundreds echoed the vow. For a moment, Alberto felt the fear leave him, replaced by a fierce unity. They were no longer smiths, bakers, or merchants. They were Lombards, brothers in arms, standing for their cities, their homes, their children. Beyond the encampment, the imperial army prepared as well. Frederick Barbarossa's knights adjusted their stirrups and tightened their harnesses. Sunlight flashed across their polished mail, their lances tall as trees. To the Italian militia, they seemed like giants, warriors bred for war. Yet Barbarossa himself was grim. He had fought the Italians before. He knew their stubbornness, their rage. His counsel urged caution, but the emperor's pride burned hotter. "These peasants think themselves warriors. Today we will trample their defiance into dust." The drums began to beat. Horns sounded across the plain. The emperor's knights lowered their lances. The Lombard militias gripped their spears tighter around the Carroccio, and between them stretched the field where freedom would be tested in fire. The morning haze lifted, revealing the imperial host in full majesty. Rank upon rank of German knights advanced, their destriers armored in steel, their banners snapping in the wind. The black eagle of the empire soared above them, and the glint of sun on thousands of lances was blinding. From the Lombard lines, it was like watching a storm of iron rolling down upon them. Men muttered prayers, others kissed small crosses hung around their necks. Alberto's palms were slick with sweat as he tightened his grip on his spear. Beside him, Matteo gave a dry laugh that sounded more like a cough. "Looks like the mountains are marching at us," he muttered. But even mountains crack. The trumpets blared. Barbarossa's cavalry surged forward, the thunder of hooves shaking the very ground. The sheer force of it seemed unstoppable, a wall of flesh and steel crashing toward the Lombard militia. "Hold the line!" came the cry from the captains. The first shock was devastating. The lances slammed into the militia ranks, shattering shields, driving men screaming into the dirt. Horses reared and crashed through the lines, their iron-shod hoofs crushing bones. The weight of the knights tore holes in the infantry, scattering men like stalks before the scythe. Alberto felt the impact shake his body to its core. His spear struck true, plunging into the chest of a charging horse. The beast toppled with a scream, hurling its rider to the ground. Before Alberto could catch his breath, another knight bore down on him. Matteo leapt, thrusting his blade into the man's exposed armpit. Blood sprayed across the dirt. "Stand your ground," Matteo roared. "They bleed like us." The militia rallied. Spears jabbed upward. Horses screamed as they were impaled. Knights dragged from their saddles into the press of furious townsmen. The clash turned savage, a grinding melee where skill mattered less than sheer will. Yet still the knights came, wave after wave, their armor gleaming, their destriers foaming. The militia bent, buckled, but around the Carroccio the line did not break. The banner of Milan still flew, bright against the storm. And so the battle raged, the fate of Lombardy trembling on a knife's edge. The plain outside Legnano was chaos. Dust, screams, and the endless crash of steel. The first charges of the German knights had smashed deep into the Lombard ranks, leaving the ground littered with broken shields and shattered spears. Yet the Carroccio still stood, and around it, the heart of the Lombard militia held fast. Alberto gasped for breath, his arms trembling as he wrenched his spear free from the fallen knight he had struck down. Blood ran down his forearm where a sword had grazed him, but he dared not falter. All around him, men fought with desperate fury. Smiths swinging heavy hammers, bakers wielding cleavers, peasants thrusting sharpened poles into the charging horses. Matteo, blood streaked across his face, bellowed above the din, "Close the gaps, shields together, hold the circle." The militia obeyed, dragging the wounded behind and locking their shields into a wall. Behind them, priests raised the crucifix high, chanting prayers that mingled with the clash of battle. The sight of the Carroccio, the scarlet drapery, the golden cross, ignited something fierce in their hearts. They were not trained soldiers, but this was their altar, their freedom, their city. To yield it was to lose everything. Another wave of knights thundered in, lances lowered. The impact shook the line, men screaming as the shields splintered. But the wall bent, it did not break. Pikes braced against the earth thrust upward into the horses' chests. Riders were hurled into the press, swallowed by the mob of militia who dragged them down with knives and axes. From afar, Barbarossa watched with narrowing eyes. He had expected the peasants to scatter, to flee at the first charge. Instead, they stood like a fortress of flesh and faith. His commanders urged fresh charges, but unease stirred in the imperial ranks. In the melee, Alberto raised his head and saw the banner of Milan still flying, defiant above the carnage. His fear gave way to something sharper, stronger. "They will not take it," he muttered, lifting his spear once more. "Not while we live." And so the militia held, the shield of Lombardy unbroken, while the empire hurled itself against them again and again. The sun climbed higher, blazing upon the blood-soaked plain. Each charge of the German knights left fresh scars upon the Lombard lines. Yet still the Carroccio stood firm, its banner streaming defiantly above the chaos. Frederick Barbarossa, crimson cloak snapping in the wind, rode among his knights. His face was carved with fury, his voice like thunder. Again, break them. They are but peasants hiding behind wood and prayer. Crush them beneath the hooves of empire. His riders obeyed. Once more, the imperial cavalry surged forward, a glittering storm of steel. The earth shook with their charge, their lances bristling like a forest of death. From the Lombard lines came the desperate cry, "Spears! Brace!" Alberto planted his weapon deep into the earth, knuckles white, heart hammering. The crash was terrible. Men hurled into the dirt, shields shattered to splinters. A horse screamed as Alberto's spear pierced its chest, collapsing atop its rider. He struggled free, the weight nearly crushing him. Matteo dragged him up by the arm. "On your feet, boy. They'll not stop till we stop them." The melee dissolved into brutal close combat. Knights hacked with long swords, their armor gleaming, but the militia swarmed like wolves. They struck from every angle, pulling men from saddles, smashing through visors with hammers, stabbing into the gaps of plate and mail. The weight of numbers pressed down, grinding knight against footman in a frenzy of survival. Yet the Imperials fought like lions, and still the Lombard shield wall bent dangerously. Barbarossa himself spurred forward with his guard, cleaving a path through the press, his sword flashing as he cut down militia by the dozen. His banner advanced perilously close to the Carroccio, and for a moment, the Milanese cross trembled in its shadow. "Defend the Carroccio!" came the cry. Alberto and Matteo were swept into the maelstrom around the sacred wagon. Priests shouted prayers, trumpets blared, and the militia fought with a madness born of desperation. Barbarossa's knights had reached the heart of Lombardy, and there, amid the blood and dust, the fate of the communes would be decided. The Carroccio became the eye of the storm. Around it, the fighting was savage beyond words. Steel rang against steel, men screamed as they fell, horses crashed into the press. The scarlet drapery of the wagon was splattered with blood, priests clinging to the cross as arrows whistled overhead. Alberto found himself shoulder to shoulder with men he had never met. Peasants from Brescia, merchants from Piacenza, farmers from Verona. Their accents were different, their trades worlds apart, yet here they fought as one body, one will. Each time a knight broke through, they closed ranks, spears and axes plunging into the armored foe until he toppled beneath the mob. Matteo fought like a man possessed, his broken shield now a club. He smashed it into the helm of a knight who tried to tear down the banner, sending the man sprawling beneath Lombard blades. "No emperor takes this wagon!" he roared, blood streaming down his face. The German knights pressed harder, their lances now abandoned for swords and maces. They hacked at the militia with ruthless strength, their destriers lashing out with hooves. Yet the very armor that made them mighty slowed them in the crush. Townsmen darted in under their guard, stabbing at joints, dragging them from their saddles. The weight of horse and knight became a prison in the swirling melee. From his vantage, Frederick Barbarossa watched with growing disbelief. Charge after charge had failed. His vaunted cavalry, the hammer of empire, was locked in a grinding stalemate with men who should have broken at the first clash. His face darkened, and he spurred his own horse closer, unwilling to accept defeat. "Press them harder," he thundered. "The wagon must fall." But the Lombards answered with defiance. Trumpets blared, and the cry rose above the din. "For the League! For the communes!" The Carroccio stood unshaken, its cross gleaming above the dust. And for the first time, the knights of the empire felt the bitter taste of doubt. The field of Legnano was a cauldron of chaos. The once proud charges of the imperial knights had dissolved into scattered melees, their destriers exhausted, their lances broken. Yet still Barbarossa hurled his men at the Carroccio, determined to tear down the banner of Milan and shatter the spirit of the League. But the militia no longer fought with fear, they fought with fury. Every fallen comrade fed their rage. Every cry from the priests at the wagons stiffened their resolve. Alberto, his face streaked with grime, drove his spear into the leg of a charging horse, sending it tumbling and pinning its rider beneath. He wrenched free the knight's sword and raised it high, shouting, "For Milan!" The cry spread like fire. "For Milan! For Lombardy!" Matteo, bloodied but unbroken, rallied a knot of spearmen. They surged forward, striking not at the knights head-on, but at their flanks, their horses, their weak points. The once scattered militia now moved like a tide, surrounding pockets of knights and cutting them down. From the ridge, the Lombard cavalry, held in reserve until now, finally swept into the fray. Guildsmen mounted on lighter horses crashed into the exhausted imperial riders, harrying them, cutting off their retreat. What had begun as a desperate defense was turning into a relentless counterattack. Barbarossa himself rode into the press, his sword flashing, his crimson cloak whipping in the dust. He struck with all the might of an emperor, cleaving his way toward the Carroccio. For a moment, it seemed the tide might break again. His banner pressed close, his guard driving into the militia. But then the reserves of the League surged in, fresh infantry pouring around the wagon, their spears bristling, their voices raised in defiance. The imperial wedge ground to a halt, surrounded on all sides. Alberto locked eyes with a German knight, his visor open, fear showing where arrogance once reigned. With a cry, Alberto struck him down, the moment echoing across the battle in 100 similar deaths. The shield of Lombardy had not only held, it had begun to push back, and Barbarossa, for all his fury, felt the iron weight of inevitability pressing down. The roar of battle swelled as the tide turned against the empire. The proud charges of Barbarossa's knights had been blunted, their formations broken, their lances shattered. Now they found themselves surrounded by men they once scorned, merchants, smiths, peasants, who fought with a ferocity born of desperation. Alberto's arms ached, his breath ragged, but he pressed on, sword rising and falling in the press of bodies. Every clang of steel sent shock through his bones, but the sight of the Carroccio's banner still flying drove him onward. Beside him, Matteo swung his broken shield like a hammer, felling a knight who had staggered too close. "Look!" Matteo shouted, pointing through the dust. There, at the heart of the melee, Frederick Barbarossa himself was fighting. His crimson cloak was torn, his helm dented, but he carved a path with the fury of a man who would rather die than yield. His guard clustered tight around him, striking down any who dared approach. The militia surged toward him with cries of vengeance. "The Emperor! Take the Emperor!" Spears thrust at his horse, swords rang against his shield. Barbarossa roared, cutting down one man, then another, his destrier kicking free of the press. Yet for all his skill, the tide closed in. Alberto caught a glimpse of the Emperor's eyes through his visor, burning with defiance, but shadowed with the knowledge of peril. For a heartbeat, history trembled. If Barbarossa fell here, the empire itself might shatter. A desperate charge by his remaining knights bought him a sliver of escape. They hacked through the militia, dragged him from the killing ground, and spurred their battered horses toward the rear. A shout went up from the Lombard ranks. "The Emperor flees!" The cry rolled across the field like thunder. Imperial morale wavered, knights glancing back in dread, and the militia, once terrified, now surged forward with renewed fury, their voices rising in a single, defiant roar. Alberto raised his sword, his chest heaving. "Drive them! Break them!" The free men of Lombardy pressed harder, and the might of empire began to crumble. Once the cry spread, "The Emperor flees!" the battlefield shifted. What had been a contest of steel and endurance turned suddenly into rout. The imperial knights, seeing their emperor retreat, faltered. Their charges grew hesitant, their cohesion shattered. Some tried to rally, wheeling their destriers back toward the Carroccio, but the Lombard militias swarmed them like wolves. Others broke altogether, spurring their horses in frantic flight across the plain. Alberto saw it unfold through sweat-blurred eyes. The proud knights who had seemed invincible at dawn were now scattered, their banners trampled in the dust. He shoved his sword into the chest of a retreating rider and felt a strange, almost unreal stillness wash over him. "They're running," he whispered. "By God, they're running." Matteo, blood dripping from his broken shield arm, barked a ragged laugh. "Aye, even emperors bleed when you stand your ground." The militia pressed forward, no longer merely defending but hunting. Spears thrust into the backs of fleeing knights, axes tore men from saddles, and shouts of victory drowned the cries of the dying. The Carroccio rolled slowly forward, priests raising the cross high as if to sanctify the rout. Across the field, Barbarossa's red cloak vanished into the haze of dust. He had survived, dragged from the carnage by his guard, but his army lay broken behind him. What was meant to be a crushing display of imperial might had dissolved into chaos, his authority shattered in the eyes of both enemies and allies. Alberto fell to his knees, too weak to stand, his sword clattering to the ground. Around him, militia embraced, wept, raised their battered weapons to the sky. Bells rang from the Carroccio, a peal of triumph that carried over the plain. Matteo placed a steady hand on the boy's shoulder. "Remember this, lad. Today we showed the world that free men can break the lances of kings." And indeed, the field of Legnano bore witness. The communes of Italy had stood against empire and prevailed. When the dust settled over Legnano, the field lay thick with wreckage. Splintered lances, broken shields, horses sprawled like toppled statues, and knights stripped of their pride as much as their armor. The cries of the wounded mingled with the peal of bells from the Carroccio, whose banner now flew higher than ever, untouched, triumphant. The militia gathered around it, weary yet unbowed. Men who had begun the day as smiths, bakers, merchants, and farmers now stood as victors over the mightiest knights of the empire. Their faces were streaked with blood and soot, their bodies trembling with exhaustion, but their eyes burned with something new, belief. Alberto leaned on his battered sword, his hands raw, his shoulders aching. He looked to Matteo, who sat on the step of the wagon, his shield splintered to nothing, his face half hidden by sweat and grime. "We did it," Alberto whispered, as though the words themselves were too large to believe. Matteo gave a tired grin. "Aye, boy, we stood, and that's all it takes to change the world." Across the plain, the remnants of Barbarossa's host scattered, their banners trampled into the mud. The emperor himself fled northward, his iron crown heavy with shame. His dream of bending Lombardy beneath the imperial heel lay shattered. In the days to come, word of the victory spread like wildfire. From Milan to Verona, from Piacenza to Brescia, church bells rang in celebration. Legnano became a symbol, a name whispered with reverence, a proof that free communes, bound not by feudal chains but by solidarity, could defy even the Holy Roman Emperor. The Lombard League, once fragile and divided, emerged united in pride, and the empire, once certain of its supremacy, would never again wield such fear over Italy. As night fell, Alberto stood beside the Carroccio, staring at the stars above. He thought of the men who lay still on the field, of the price paid, and of the freedom won. "Not kings," he murmured, gripping the bloodied wood of the wagon. "Not emperors. It was us." And so, at Legnano, a new Italy was born, not in courts or palaces, but in the blood and courage of its people.